The prison air was thick with sweat, regret, and the kind of silence that came from men who had lost everything. Sergeant Ethan Cole sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the cold concrete wall, his hands clenched into fists so tight his nails dug into his palms. The clock on the far side of the cell block ticked forward, but time had long since stopped meaning anything to him. 5 years. 5 years in a cage for a crime he hadn't committed. A murderer, that's what they called him. A traitor, that's what the prosecution had painted him as. A guilty man, that's what the jury had decided in less than an hour. And yet, here he was, still fighting for the one thing that had kept him sane. Shadow, his K-9 partner, his brother in arms, the only one who had never doubted him. The military had reassigned Shadow after Ethan's conviction, but reports said the dog had never fully adjusted to a new handler. Ethan had tried not to think about it. What good did it do to dwell on the past? But lately, it had been clawing at him like an open wound, and now, he had a chance. "Cole," a guard's voice rang out, breaking the stillness of his cell. "Warden wants to see you." Ethan's pulse quickened, but he didn't let it show. He stood slowly, rolling his shoulders to shake the stiffness from his muscles. The other prisoners barely looked up. No one cared what happened to a disgraced Marine. The guard led him through the maze of halls, past blank-eyed inmates and watchful correctional officers. The closer they got to the warden's office, the heavier the air felt in Ethan's lungs. This was it. This was his one shot. The final request he had begged for. Warden Harold Briggs was a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, his face lined with the weight of years spent running a maximum security prison. He barely glanced up from the file in front of him as Ethan entered. "You're lucky, Cole," Briggs grunted, flipping a page. "Most guys don't get last requests before they rot in here." Ethan didn't take the bait. He had learned to shut up and listen when necessary. Briggs sighed, tapping a pen against the file. "You want to see your K-9? "Yes, sir. You're aware military dogs don't usually keep their old handlers, especially convicted ones?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I know." "Then you also know that Shadow has been reassigned for years. He's got a new handler, a new unit, and from what I hear, he's doing just fine." Ethan didn't respond. He knew that was a lie. Shadow had been through 4 different handlers since his conviction. 4. That wasn't normal. Briggs studied him, as if looking for a weakness. "Tell me, Cole, why should I waste time arranging this?" Ethan swallowed his pride. This wasn't about him. This was about Shadow. "He was my partner," he said, voice steady. "He saved my life more times than I can count. He deserves to know why I never came back for him." Briggs raised a brow, and for a split second, Ethan thought he saw something other than disdain in his expression. A pause. Then, "You get 10 minutes. Ethan's heart pounded as he stood in the prison yard, his hands clenched at his sides. The guards stood back, uninterested. To them, this was just another inmate getting a favor he didn't deserve. Then the gate opened, and there he was, Shadow. The black Belgian Malinois walked with precise, measured steps, his body still lean and powerful despite the years that had passed. His deep brown eyes were locked forward, trained, controlled, a military K-9 through and through. Ethan exhaled sharply. God, he looks different. The handler, a young lieutenant with too much confidence and too little understanding, held Shadow's leash tightly. "You got 10 minutes, the handler muttered. "Don't get any ideas." Ethan barely heard him. His focus was on Shadow's eyes, sharp, watchful, but something else. Confusion. Ethan took a step forward, pulse hammering. "Hey, boy." Shadow's ears twitched. He recognized the voice. Ethan knelt slowly, swallowing the lump in his throat. "It's me." A tense silence hung in the air. Then Shadow moved. The rigid military posture melted in an instant. The dog's tail whipped furiously, and a sharp, strangled whimper left his throat as he lunged forward, nearly ripping the leash from his handler's grip. "Whoa, easy!" The lieutenant yanked back, but it was too late. Shadow was fighting to get to Ethan. The dog, a creature trained to kill, to obey, to never let emotions override commands, was breaking protocol. Ethan's chest clenched. You didn't forget. He opened his arms, and Shadow crashed into him. The military K-9, feared by enemy combatants, trusted in war zones, trained to take down the most dangerous threats, was now whimpering, pushing his head against Ethan's chest, paws scrabbling as if to climb into his arms. The handler stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. Shadow let out a low, sorrowful whine, pressing himself as close as possible, as if afraid Ethan would disappear again. Ethan buried his face into Shadow's thick fur, his breath shaky. "I know, boy," he murmured, voice breaking. "I know." For the first time in 5 years, Ethan felt like someone still believed in him. And then, his fingers brushed against a small scar beneath the thick fur of Shadow's neck. Something that wasn't there before. A scar that looked like it came from a deep, deliberate cut. Ethan's mind sharpened in an instant. His training kicked in, his body tensing. Because Shadow hadn't just been reassigned, someone had tried to kill him. Ethan pulled back, his eyes meeting Shadow's. The dog's tail had stopped wagging. He was watching Ethan carefully now, as if sensing his shift in energy. And that's when Ethan knew. Shadow had something to tell him. Something about the night of the murder, his wrongful conviction, his only chance to prove the truth, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. Ethan's fingers hovered over the scar on Shadow's neck, his heartbeat quickening. It was old, but not too old. Maybe a year, 2 at most. It ran along the side of the dog's throat, partially hidden beneath the thick fur. Not from training, not from combat, from a blade. His gut twisted. Someone had tried to silence Shadow. His K9 had been a witness. Ethan swallowed hard, staring at the dog that had once been his lifeline in war. And now, Shadow was trying to tell him something. His mind snapped into mission mode. Everything about that night, the night that ruined his life, came rushing back. 5 years ago. The Afghan night was thick with tension, the kind that made a man check his rifle twice. Ethan stood outside the barracks, Shadow at his side, both of them tense as hell. They had just returned from patrol, but something felt off. Then, the gunshot. Ethan sprinted toward the sound, Shadow bolting ahead, his ears pinned back, a growl already forming. They rounded the corner, and there he was, Captain Reese, Ethan's commanding officer, sprawled across the ground in the dim moonlight. A single bullet to the chest. Ethan had dropped to his knees, feeling for a pulse. Nothing. And then, Shadow barked. A shadow moved in the distance. Someone was there. Ethan had barely raised his weapon when MPs swarmed him, tackling him to the ground. Before he could process what was happening, someone yelled, "Drop the weapon! Drop the weapon!" His hands were wrenched behind his back, his face pressed into the dirt. And the next thing he knew, he was being called a murderer. He had never even gotten the chance to explain. Shadow had growled and fought the MPs, trying to reach Ethan, but they had pulled the dog away, separating them that very night. And now, 5 years later, Ethan realized the truth. Shadow had seen the real killer, his fingers curled into a fist. His breath came slow, steady. His training had taught him to read the situation, to adapt, to survive. And right now, he was in survival mode. He slowly lifted his gaze to the handler standing in the corner of the visitation room. Lieutenant Mason Trent, Shadow's new handler. Ethan studied him, every detail, his stiff posture, his slight discomfort, the way his hands tightened around the leash, as something wasn't right. Ethan was analyzing the enemy again. Trent hadn't expected Shadow's reaction. His face was too controlled, like he was forcing himself not to react. He knew something. He knew about Shadow's scar. Ethan took a slow breath, careful not to let his rising fury show. He needed to play this smart. He was still in a prison, still an inmate, and if he made the wrong move, this visit could be his last. He looked down at Shadow, running his hand through the dog's fur, fingers tracing the outline of a familiar collar tag beneath the thick coat. The tag had been replaced since Ethan's time, a military-issued identification number, but something about it felt wrong. The numbers weren't etched deep enough. This wasn't standard issue. It was new, fake. A chill spread through Ethan's chest. Someone had tried to cover something up. And that meant one thing. Whoever was behind this murder wasn't done covering their tracks. His pulse slowed. His mind sharpened. He had a new mission now. Get to the truth. Get to whoever had framed him. And Shadow was the key. Ethan kept his voice casual, his hands still stroking Shadow's fur like he was just a man seeing his dog for the first time in years. "You a dog guy, Lieutenant?" he asked, not looking up. Trent hesitated, just for a second, but Ethan caught it. "Yeah," Trent said, forcing a grin. Shadow's one of the best." Ethan let the silence stretch, watching the man out of the corner of his eye. "Bet he's got a lot of stories," Ethan murmured, scratching behind Shadow's ear in the way that used to calm him down after combat. Trent's grip tightened on the leash. "Sure." Ethan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Like this one?" And before Trent could react, Ethan gently pressed his fingers over the scar on Shadow's neck. Instantly, Shadow flinched. A low, deep growl rumbled in the dog's chest. Not at Ethan, at Trent. Ethan looked up just in time to see Trent's face drain of color. Bingo. Ethan sat back, stretching his arms like he wasn't in a maximum security prison, wearing an orange jumpsuit. "Funny," he said. "Didn't have this scar last time I saw him." Trent shrugged, trying to regain his composure. "Dogs get injuries all the time, part of the job." Ethan smiled, slow, calculated, a predator watching prey. "Sure," he nodded. "Just like how people get framed for things they didn't do." Trent didn't flinch, but his jaw locked. Ethan saw it then, the sweat forming at his temple, the way he wouldn't meet Ethan's gaze. This was it. Trent knew. Maybe he wasn't the guy, but he knew who was. And if Ethan had learned anything from his military days, it was this. People like Trent cracked under pressure. Ethan exhaled, looking down at Shadow again. The dog was still growling, still waiting for a command. Ethan had a choice: make his move now, or wait. He smiled again, leaning forward. "You ever kill a man, Lieutenant?" Trent stiffened. "Because if you're lying to me," Ethan said, his voice low, lethal, "Shadow's going to know before I do." Trent took a step back, just one. Ethan grinned, like a shark smelling blood in the water. And then... The prison door swung open. A guard stepped in, checking his watch. "Time's up, Cole." "Not yet, it isn't." Ethan stood slowly, towering over Trent. Shadow stayed pressed against his side, his ears locked forward, his stance protective. This wasn't over, not even close. Ethan gave Shadow one last firm pat, and then looked Trent dead in the eye. "I'm gonna figure it out," Ethan murmured, his voice deadly calm. "And when I do, you better hope I'm still locked in here." Trent swallowed, hard. And for the first time since stepping into that room, Ethan saw something in his eyes that wasn't just nerves, it was fear. The heavy steel doors slammed shut behind Ethan, but his mind wasn't in the prison anymore. It was outside, where the real enemy was still walking free. His boots echoed on the concrete floor as the guards led him back to his cell, but he barely heard them. Shadow had given him the answer he'd been looking for. Trent was hiding something. The way the lieutenant had flinched at the mention of Shadow's scar, the way he had gone stiff when Ethan applied pressure. It was all too familiar. Ethan had spent years reading men in combat, and he could see a guilty one from a mile away. The only question now was, how deep did this go? As they reached his cell, one of the guards sneered. "What's the matter, Cole? Didn't get the happy reunion you wanted?" Ethan didn't respond. He kept his head down, stepping inside as the iron door clanked shut behind him. They all thought he was beaten. They all thought he was just a broken soldier, serving time for a crime he didn't commit. But they had no idea that Ethan Cole wasn't done fighting. Lying on his cot, staring at the ceiling, Ethan ran through every interaction he had ever had with Captain Reese, the man he was accused of murdering. Reese had been a hard man, but fair. He had trusted Ethan. Hell, the man had once told him, "If anything ever happens to me, I know you'll figure it out." At the time, Ethan had thought it was just Reese being dramatic. But now it felt like a warning. The night of the murder, Reese had been on edge, talking about corruption, about something bigger than them. He had told Ethan that he had information, something about illegal weapons shipments going missing, people getting paid off. Then, hours later, Reese was dead, and Ethan was behind bars. Shadow had been there that night. He had seen the real killer, and judging by his reaction to Trent was involved. Ethan sat up slowly. Trent wasn't the mastermind. He was the cleanup guy, the one who tied up loose ends. The real question was, who was he working for? Ethan had no access to the outside world, no way to dig into military records. But what he did have? Time. Time to observe, to listen, to find the weak points. And he knew exactly where to start. In prison, you learned quickly that everyone had a price. Ethan had been keeping a mental list of inmates and guards who had their own side hustles. People who could get things if you knew the right way to ask. His best bet? Frankie "Slim" Morales. A former Air Force logistics officer, Frankie had been busted for running black market supply chains inside the military. The guy could smuggle anything, and more importantly, he had connections to people still on the outside. That's exactly what Ethan needed. That night, in the prison yard, Ethan made his move. He walked up to Frankie, who was sitting on the bleachers, watching a group of inmates play basketball. Frankie didn't look up. "Long time, Cole," he muttered, tapping his foot. "Didn't think you were the type to come asking for favors." Ethan didn't waste time. "I need to know everything about Lieutenant Mason Trent." That made Frankie pause. His gaze flicked up, sharp and calculating. "Military guy, K-9 handler, right?" "You already know who he is," Ethan said. Frankie smirked. "I make it my business to know who's dirty in the system." Ethan crossed his arms. "Then tell me." Frankie exhaled, tapping his fingers against his knee. "Trent's not just some grunt. He's tied to a big operation. Military contracts, missing shipments, the kind of stuff that gets people killed. The guy's been covering tracks for someone way higher up." Ethan's gut clenched. This was bigger than he thought. "Who's pulling the strings?" Frankie leaned forward. "There's a name that keeps coming up, Brigadier General Marcus Holloway. Word is, Reese was digging into something he wasn't supposed to." Ethan went still. Holloway. That name had come up once before, years ago, when Reese had pulled Ethan aside and told him he didn't trust some of the higher-ups, that they were moving equipment and funds that weren't accounted for. And now, Reese was dead, Ethan was in prison, and Trent was the link between them. Ethan's blood ran cold. If Holloway was involved, it meant one thing. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about survival. Because if Holloway found out Ethan was getting close to the truth, he'd make sure Ethan never left that prison alive. Ethan took a slow breath. This wasn't just a game anymore. This was a battlefield, and Ethan never lost on the battlefield. He needed to get a message to someone outside the prison walls, someone who could confirm what Frankie had just told him. But he didn't have a phone, no legal access to mail. But he did have one thing Holloway and Trent didn't expect: Shadow. If Shadow was still reacting aggressively to Trent, it meant the dog hadn't forgotten what happened that night. And if Ethan could just get one piece of solid proof that linked Trent to the murder, he'd blow this whole thing wide open. That night, Ethan lay on his cot, eyes locked on the ceiling. He knew Trent would come back. The lieutenant had seen the look in Ethan's eyes during their visit. He knew Ethan was putting pieces together, and that meant Trent was scared. Good, because tomorrow Ethan was going to make sure that fear turned into panic. Trent thought he had buried the past. He had no idea that Ethan was about to dig it up. Ethan lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, his mind running through every possible angle, every weakness, every move his enemies would make before they made it. Trent was scared. Ethan had seen the flicker of panic in his eyes when Shadow growled at him. Trent wasn't just hiding something. He was actively trying to keep Ethan from figuring it out. And that meant Trent would come back. He had to. The moment Trent realized Ethan wasn't letting this go, he'd try to shut him down. Maybe through intimidation, maybe through something worse. And Ethan had to be ready. Prison had a way of teaching a man patience. The days blurred together into a routine of head counts, bad food, and quiet observations. Ethan watched Trent. Whenever the lieutenant came to the prison to check on Shadow, Ethan took note of every move he made, the way he avoided eye contact, the way he never lingered too long around the other guards, the way his hands sometimes twitched when he was talking, nervous tick. He was hiding something. Ethan wasn't the only one who noticed. "You're up to something." Frankie Morales, the ex-Air Force logistics officer who could get anything from the outside world, slid onto the bench across from Ethan in the mess hall. His tray of food was untouched, his dark eyes filled with curiosity. Ethan didn't answer, just took a slow bite of his bland, overcooked chicken. Frankie smirked. "Come on, Cole. You don't talk to anyone, you don't play cards, and suddenly you're keeping tabs on one of your old military buddies? Spill." Ethan swallowed. "I need a favor." Frankie leaned forward, intrigued. "Let's hear it." Ethan glanced around the room, ensuring no one was listening. "I need information on Trent, and I need a way to get a message outside the walls." Frankie whistled low. "You trying to get yourself killed?" Ethan didn't flinch. You in or out? Frankie sighed, rubbing his chin. You know, I got a cousin, still in the military, works in records. For the right price, I might be able to get him to pull some interesting files. Ethan raised a brow. What price? Frankie smirked. Let's just say I need a little protection from some unfriendly faces. Ethan nodded. Done. Just like that, the game was in motion. 2 days later, Ethan got exactly what he wanted. The moment Trent stepped into the visitation room, Ethan saw the shift in his body language, the stiff shoulders, the tension in his jaw. Trent was done playing games. You need to stop, Trent said the second the door shut behind him. No pleasantries, no formalities, just thinly veiled desperation. Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Stop what? Trent's eyes darted to the guard in the corner. He lowered his voice. I know you've been digging. Bingo. Ethan tilted his head. You worried about something, Lieutenant? Trent exhaled sharply, leaning in. His voice was low, dangerous. You don't know what you're getting yourself into, Cole. Ethan's pulse remained steady, but his mind was racing. Trent was cracking. He wouldn't be here if he wasn't desperate. Ethan grinned. Time to push. I know about Holloway, he said casually. I know Reese was onto something before he died, and I know you're involved. Trent went pale. For a moment, his mask slipped, his fingers twitched. Then, just as fast, it was back. But not fast enough. Ethan had his confirmation. Trent stood abruptly. This conversation never happened. Ethan smiled up at him. Oh, it happened, and you just told me everything I need to know. Trent's hands curled into fists at his sides. Ethan watched him carefully, waiting. Would Trent make his move now? Try to shut Ethan up before this spiraled out of control? Then, Trent did something unexpected. He smirked, and for the first time, Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. Trent stepped closer, voice just above a whisper. You think you're in control, Cole? You think you're going to find justice? He chuckled, shaking his head. You're never getting out of here. Ever. Then he walked out, leaving Ethan staring after him. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt fear creeping in. 2 nights later, everything changed. Ethan was lying in his cell, going over his plan for the 100th time, when a guard appeared at his door. You got a visitor. Ethan frowned. I didn't request one. The guard shrugged. Guess someone requested you. Ethan's muscles tensed as he followed the guard down the halls. This wasn't standard procedure. Inmates didn't just get called for random visitors. Who the hell was waiting for him? The second he stepped into the visitors area, his blood ran cold. Sitting there, in a crisp military uniform, was General Marcus Holloway. Ethan locked eyes with him, forcing his expression to remain blank. Holloway smiled. You're causing quite a stir, Sergeant. Ethan sat down slowly, keeping his voice level. Wish I could say the same for you, General. Thought you'd be busy signing papers in Washington. Holloway chuckled. Oh, I stay busy. But when I heard an old Marine was asking the wrong kind of questions, I figured I should check in. Ethan clenched his jaw. This was a warning. Holloway leaned forward, folding his hands together. Let's make something clear, Cole. Your case? It's dead. The evidence is stacked against you, and nobody out there is looking to dig it back up. Ethan remained silent. Holloway's smile faded. I don't know what you think you're doing, but let me give you some advice. Drop it. Ethan stared at him, unblinking. Holloway sighed and stood. You're a soldier, Cole. You know how this works. Some battles, you don't win. Ethan stayed still as Holloway walked out of the room. His hands were clenched beneath the table. His heartbeat was a steady, cold rage. Holloway had just confirmed everything. Reese had been murdered because he got too close, and now Holloway was threatening Ethan into silence. That was his mistake, because Holloway had just made one fatal miscalculation. Ethan Cole never backed down from a fight. If they thought they could bury the truth, they were dead wrong. Holloway thought he had won. That was his mistake. Ethan Cole sat in his cell, his mind racing, faster, sharper, deadlier than it had in years. This wasn't a battle anymore. This was war, and Ethan, he had one mission. Expose Holloway, clear his name, and get the hell out of this prison before they made him disappear for good. Shadow had given him the proof. Trent's fear had confirmed it. Holloway had sent him a message. Drop it. Let it go. Accept your fate. But what Holloway didn't realize was that Ethan Cole never followed orders he didn't believe in, and he sure as hell wasn't dying in this cage. Step 1. The distraction. To bring down a man like Holloway, Ethan needed two things: leverage and a way out. Luckily, he had both. That night, Ethan slipped Frankie a folded scrap of paper in the mess hall. Frankie didn't ask questions, just nodded and walked off. Phase 1 had begun. At exactly 3 a.m., a fight broke out in cell block C. It started small, a shove, a curse, but within seconds it turned into an all-out riot. Guards flooded the block, trying to break it up, but they didn't realize they were being played. In the chaos, Ethan slipped away. He had 30 seconds. That's all he needed. Step 2. The proof. The prison records room was on the second floor, guarded and locked at all times. For most inmates, that meant impossible. For Ethan, it meant a challenge. He reached the door, picked the lock in 5 seconds flat, and slipped inside. The place was a mess of cabinets and old computers, but Ethan knew exactly what he was looking for. Trent's personnel file. He tore through the drawers, his pulse steady, until... there. Lieutenant Mason Trent. Ethan flipped through the pages, searching for a connection to Holloway. Then, he saw it. A bank transfer. $250,000 wired into Trent's account 2 weeks after Ethan's conviction. From Holloway's personal shell company. The smoking gun. Ethan let out a slow breath. This was it. This was proof that Trent had been paid off to cover up Reese's murder. He quickly stuffed the papers into his jumpsuit and turned, only to find himself face to face with a guard. Ethan's reflexes kicked in before his brain could process the danger. One punch. Direct, brutal, fast. The guard crumpled to the ground before he could raise the alarm. Ethan dragged him inside, locked the door, and slipped back into the chaos. Step 3. The escape. Ethan had less than 2 minutes before the prison went into full lockdown. He moved fast, silent, efficient, using the fight as cover. By the time the guards realized he was gone, he was already outside, hidden in the shadows near the K9 training yard. And that's when he saw him. Shadow. The dog was in his kennel, ears alert, scanning, waiting. Ethan clicked his tongue twice, an old signal. Shadow's head snapped toward him. Then, in a blur of black fur, Shadow launched forward, breaking free of his cage like he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. One problem. The prison floodlights clicked on. "Prisoner escape! Inmate Cole is loose!" The sirens shrieked. Ethan turned to run, only to see 3 guards sprinting toward him, weapons drawn. He had come too far to die here. Shadow growled low and tensed beside him, ready to attack. Ethan made a decision. He charged straight at the guards. Step 4. The fight. Ethan hit the first guard before the man could react. A sharp elbow to the face dropped him instantly. The second guard raised his baton, but Shadow lunged, teeth locking onto the man's arm, sending him crashing to the ground with a scream. The third guard was smart. He went for his radio. Ethan tackled him to the ground before he could call for backup. A single, precise chokehold, and the man slumped unconscious. Ethan exhaled, heart hammering. Shadow was panting, eyes locked onto his old handler. They didn't have time to celebrate. The entire prison was going into full lockdown. Ethan whistled low. "Let's go, boy." Shadow didn't hesitate. They ran. Step 5. The escape route. Frankie had done his job. Ethan's way out was exactly where it was supposed to be. A stolen maintenance van parked near the loading dock. Ethan yanked the door open. Shadow jumped in, and within seconds, the engine roared to life. The gates were ahead. Locked. He had one shot. Ethan floored it. The metal gate buckled as the van crashed through, the impact sending a shockwave through Ethan's bones. For a second, he thought the van would stall. Then, the vehicle broke free, and suddenly they were on the open road. Free. Ethan's breath came fast, sharp, but he couldn't stop now. He had the proof. He had Shadow, and he had one last thing to do. He was going to end this. Ethan drove through the night, hands tight on the wheel, knowing he only had one shot at this. He pulled over at a gas station, dug through the stolen files, and found exactly what he needed, an emergency contact number for a military investigative unit. He grabbed a burner phone from the glove compartment, took a breath, and dialed. 1 ring, 2, then a voice answered. Who the hell is this? Ethan exhaled. My name is Sergeant Ethan Cole, he said, and I have evidence that General Holloway murdered Captain Reese. The line went silent. Then, where are you? Ethan glanced at Shadow. The dog stared back, unwavering. Somewhere Holloway won't find me, Ethan said. Yet. Because this wasn't over, not yet. But by the time it was, Holloway would be the one behind bars. The stolen van rattled down the back roads, its tires kicking up dust as Ethan drove into the night. The cold air rushed through the shattered side window, but he barely felt it. His mind was locked on one thing: Brigadier General Marcus Holloway. The man who had orchestrated the cover-up, the man who had framed Ethan for a murder he didn't commit, the man who had nearly gotten Shadow killed to bury the last witness. Now, Ethan was coming for him. Beside him, Shadow lay on the passenger seat, his ears perked, his eyes locked on the road ahead. Even after all these years, the dog's instincts were still sharp. He knew this wasn't over. Ethan checked the GPS. 1 hour until Washington, D.C. 1 hour until he walked straight into enemy territory. 1 hour until he finished this. Ethan needed to move fast. Holloway had power, resources, men. If he got even a whisper of Ethan being out, he'd erase him before morning. That meant striking first. He pulled into a rundown motel just off the highway, parked the van behind the building, and grabbed the burner phone. He had one number, a military investigative contact that Frankie had dug up. A long shot. But long shots were all Ethan had left. He dialed. 1 ring, 2, 3. A voice answered. Who is this? Ethan took a breath. Sergeant Ethan Cole, wrongfully convicted of Captain Reese's murder. I have proof Brigadier General Holloway ordered the hit. I need protection. Silence. Then, this a joke? Ethan's voice was steady, deadly. Check the evidence I just sent to your email, then tell me if it's a joke. He had attached Trent's bank transfers, logs, and service reports, everything pointing to the payoff that tied him to Holloway. The line stayed silent. Then, where are you? Ethan exhaled. Heading to D.C., I need this handled now. The voice on the other end hardened. Stay put, we're sending someone. Ethan hung up immediately. He knew better. No one was coming to help. The only way this ended was if he ended it himself. Holloway's headquarters was located in a high-security government facility in Washington, D.C., which meant getting in was damn near impossible. For most people, Ethan wasn't most people. At exactly 2 a.m., he parked a few blocks away from the facility. It was a 6-story, heavily guarded structure surrounded by armed personnel, surveillance cameras, and high-tech security systems. But Ethan wasn't going through the front door. He had a better way in. He had Shadow. They moved through the shadows, Ethan memorizing guard patterns, his military training kicking in like a reflex. He spotted a utility entrance, leading to a maintenance tunnel beneath the building. One problem, 2 guards. Ethan knelt next to Shadow, whispered, "Seek!" The dog's ears twitched. Then, he was gone, silent as a ghost. Seconds later, a blood-curdling scream rang through the night. Ethan moved. By the time the guards realized what was happening, Shadow was on them. One went down screaming, the other barely had time to react, before Ethan slammed his fist into his throat, dropping him instantly. Shadow trotted back, tail wagging, eyes gleaming. Ethan smirked. Good boy. They slipped inside. Holloway's headquarters was located in a high-security government facility in Washington, D.C., which meant getting in was damn near impossible. For most people, Ethan wasn't most people. At exactly 2 a.m., he parked a few blocks away from the facility. It was a 6-story, heavily guarded structure, surrounded by armed personnel, surveillance cameras, and high-tech security systems. But Ethan wasn't going through the front door. He had a better way in. He had Shadow. They moved through the shadows, Ethan memorizing guard patterns, his military training kicking in like a reflex. He spotted a utility entrance leading to a maintenance tunnel beneath the building. One problem, 2 guards. Ethan knelt next to Shadow, whispered, "Seek!" The dog's ears twitched. Then, he was gone, silent as a ghost. Seconds later, a blood-curdling scream rang through the night. Ethan moved. By the time the guards realized what was happening, Shadow was on them. One went down screaming, the other barely had time to react, before Ethan slammed his fist into his throat, dropping him instantly. Shadow trotted back, tail wagging, eyes gleaming. Ethan smirked. Good boy. They slipped inside. Holloway's office was on the 6th floor. Ethan moved like a ghost, weaving through the corridors, every nerve on fire. One step too loud, 1 second too slow, and it was all over. Finally, he reached the office door. He didn't knock, he kicked it open. And there he was, Brigadier General Marcus Holloway, sitting behind a massive oak desk, surrounded by monitors, classified documents, and military-grade security systems. The old man barely flinched. He looked up, expression unreadable. Well, he sighed, leaning back in his chair. You actually made it. Ethan stepped inside, gun raised, Shadow growling at his side. You're going to confess, Ethan said, voice low, steady. You're going to tell them exactly what you did. Holloway chuckled. And why the hell would I do that? Ethan didn't answer. He slid a flash drive onto the desk. All the proof, bank logs, transfer records, every piece of dirt you tried to bury. Holloway picked up the drive, inspecting it lazily. And what do you think happens now, Sergeant? You think you're walking out of here alive? Ethan stared him down. I don't think. I know. Holloway smirked. You always were naive. Then, he pressed a button under his desk. The alarm screamed to life. Shit. Ethan moved fast. Holloway reached for a drawer, probably for a weapon. Ethan's gun was already out. One shot, straight to the knee. Holloway screamed, collapsing onto his desk. You think I'm playing games? Ethan snarled. I have nothing to lose. Holloway groaned, clutching his bleeding leg. That proof goes public in 5 minutes, Ethan continued. If I don't walk out of here, you go down anyway. Sirens wailed outside. Footsteps thundered down the hall. Ethan looked at Shadow. The dog was tense, waiting, ready. This was it. He had 2 choices: fight his way out, or dash. He grabbed the desk phone, dialed the number from the burner. The military investigator picked up instantly. Ethan held the phone to Holloway's face. You want to tell them what you did? He growled. Or do you want them to drag your ass out of here in cuffs? Holloway was pale, shaking, bleeding. For the first time, he looked afraid. The door burst open, armed officers storming in. Ethan raised his hand slowly. Sergeant Ethan Cole, he said, wrongfully convicted. I just delivered your evidence. The officers hesitated, then looked at Holloway. And just like that, the tables had turned. 3 weeks later, Ethan stood outside the prison gates, the cool air feeling surreal against his skin. He was free. The real killer? Trent. Confession extracted. Holloway, stripped of rank, facing trial. And Shadow? The military had granted Ethan full custody. The dog sat by his side, watching the world with sharp, knowing eyes. A reporter shoved a mic in Ethan's face. What's next for you, Sergeant? Ethan glanced down at Shadow, then at the open road ahead. He smirked. Not sure yet, he said, but wherever I go, he goes. Shadow wagged his tail, and for the first time in 5 years, Ethan felt like he was finally going home.